All right, I think I got one for you here. There's this sense of being buried in history and buried in time in terms of the human purpose and the human being's relationship to human purpose. And so what I mean by that is that this is primarily a cultural problem. It's a problem of history, it's a problem of religion, it's a problem of science, it's a problem of philosophy, and it's a problem of acculturation to means. So when you're working with the basic template of the human body or the human organism, you have latent potentialities that are essentially and primarily energetic potentialities, right? So you have the organ system, the blood system, the nervous system, and the interrelations of those systems, which pretty clearly culminate and correlate and interrelate with the creation of the forebrain, which is the capacity to think upon those latent potentials, which are the potentials of the animal or the organism or nature as an evolutionary possibility latent within the genome, right? The genome is what makes human evolution possible and makes evolution and life on Earth possible as a chain and a thread of information, which is a codification of chemicals. So we're looking at a evolutionary status, which, as we've discussed in the previous essays and orations, is a status which is oriented towards a certain perspective, which is to continue that species order and to continue that evolutionary order of the organism itself, as in survival and reproduction. So we're looking at a basic thermodynamic elemental energetic possibility, which is a metabolic possibility, the same as in a stellar nucleosynthesis, a nuclear fusionary possibility, a thermonuclear fusionary possibility at the level of stars and star systems. But it's a question of accessing and harnessing and orienting that energy towards a dedicated outcome or purpose, right? So we're talking primarily and realistically about means and ends and how to unlock. And I used the term jailbreaking before because I think it's a pretty clear technological analog to a hardware system with inherent and innate capacities and capabilities in terms of expanding a knowledge base and a process base. The accessing and harnessing of the inherent metabolic energy, which is the force of will which runs through the cosmos proper. We've discussed the different scales at which that energy is transferred, translated, and transmuted down from star systems and the creation of the universe into organisms and single-celled organisms. So when we're talking about that process of jailbreaking, we're looking at this latent thermodynamic thermonuclear will as the inherent energetic possibilities of existence, creation, and the universe itself proper. And making manifest that latent energetic possibility into space, into time, and as such revelating the human being, revelating nature, revelating existence out from under this, as we've discussed, this charnel house, this rubble, this ruin of history and this ruin of time, through and from which has emerged, again, this return of the energetic possibility, which has been sort of raptured and ruptured and shaped into a specific orientation and perspective. It's been captivated through the evolution of the genetic nature, through the evolution of the species time, into a certain framework, which is the way in which that organism perceives and orients itself toward reality, and as such translates its metabolic possibilities, its aperture, its vision into practice. So we're looking at a repeated reality in practice, which is the phenomenological everyday. The repetition of a reality which is being created and recreated at a species level, produced and reproduced at a species level through and by means of the aperture which is being experienced at the species level. It's the orientation of the species towards the template and aperture of existence, the actual undelimited possibilities of existence itself proper, but through which the organism has been constricted or fit through this evolutionary funnel or tube, which we could simply call the movement of space-time, the movement of space and time, and the creation of the form of the human being through it. Again, basic metabolic elemental limitations in the construction of the human being. So the question is, how do we release and unleash and jailbreak that essential existence, that essence, that force of primordial will out from under the symbolic ecosystem of the individual or the organism or the human being? And this is the question which is at the source and root of science, philosophy, culture, right? These are all attempts, as Nietzsche would say, to apprehend and accumulate and understand the fundamental primordial power, which is the greatest power, which is the universal. It is the universal thermonuclear metabolic will down across all scales, which is the possible energetic power of all creation and all existence, which has been transformed as a transformer down into and through the individual. So a big part of this, as we discussed in the last essay, is a understanding of what that essential identity is. And we went through the various different possibilities, speaking about Dizzy Dean, and understood that the greatest or most accurate characterization using our most up-to-date and hyper-modern physics, cosmology, quantum mechanics is that the universe is a recombinator of play. It's an inherent linguistic and supralinguistic playfulness, which is creating forms through universal recombination, which is the creation and recreation of forms through different elemental, chemical interfaces down through space, through time, and through scales, which are creating various different phenomenological realities and thus apertures of perception, as in the creation of organisms. So we discussed that, right, to understand this essential characteristic of the will of being beneath and before time, which is to say that which it is. And then in a second sense, it is to incarnate and express the full powers and potentialities of this will, to harness them through, again, as we discussed with baseball and Hack Wilson, through aesthetic play. And this is the critical dimension, because the will historically in a human being sense or aperture has been translated through a jailed or a prisoned sense into various different predictable outcomes, which are the churn and repetition of human history, which is to say the drive toward power in an organism sense, toward accumulation, toward resisting scarcity or resisting organism death, right? Again, orientation towards survival of the organism, orientation towards the possibilities of genetic reproduction, again, mating, which are the basic principles of the animal existence or the organism existence. It's to produce, to reproduce not only the self, but to reproduce the genetic chain and further the species. So we're looking at, again, the metabolic possibilities, the thermonuclear possibilities, and the essential inherent will possibilities as manifest in and as, ultimately, a total expression of the organism, and the organism as a total expression of creation, which has been broken from that through the prism of its lens of creationary possibilities, which are delimited necessarily toward the organism's survival, reproduction, consumption. So when we're talking about jailbreaking the will, this concept, what is so essential is, again, the identification of play, recombinative experimental play, as described first with Heraclitus and affirmed and reaffirmed with our modern understandings of cosmology, modern understandings of stellar nucleosynthesis, modern understandings of genetic recombination. But then also to have that aperture, right, which is so critical, and this is where culture as a practice and a process and a ritual comes in, of the aesthetic unveiling of the powers of the will, the aesthetic participation of the will in existence and revelation of the will through these means that are fundamentally and inherently superhuman beyond the human being, as in the limited and delimited aperture of the application of the will to survival, consumption, reproduction. Right? So this is the chain, this is a teleology of events which our history themselves, which produce and reproduce essentially all of history as a phenomenon and a phenomenology of the human being's limitation in the face of the primordial will, and thus the necessity of the recognition of the primordial will to break the chain of history, to reveal the singularity of the primordial essential will, and thus to actually inhabit a radically different state of being, which is revelation. And so when we talk about this, we are in reality talking about the human being entering into a hyperspace of the aesthetic dimension of the participation in existence or reality itself. The harnessing of the powers and the drives and the force of will, which is inherent and latent in the individual and the organism as a thermodynamics, a thermonuclear supposition, which is translated down to the metabolic organism itself. It inherits and consumes the same powers, which are the powers of the consumption of the sun and the solar system and the star systems that surround it, and encompass it as in the universal, which is the network of the galactic, which themselves are star systems, to harness that inherent metabolic potential to gather the powers of the human and devote them to this aesthetic practice, which is dedicated to, whether consciously or not, and as we've discussed with baseball history, it's essentially unconsciously, unless there's a mystic history of baseball that we don't necessarily know that has been hidden to a certain sector or another, which of course is quite possible, consciously or not, to dedicate these whole powers, these whole metabolic powers toward the salvation, the solution, and the solve of this aesthetic realm, which is entirely oriented around the phenomenological, as in the appearance of, as in the performance of, the emergence of, the participation in, the revelation of the total powers of existence themselves through the jailbroken biological aperture of the human being, right? The full harnessing of the powers of the will and the wills, which are dedicated entirely upward and outward toward this manifestation, this phenomenological emergence of that which is the essential will into space, into time, and thus a jailbreaking into the singularity of existence itself, the revelation of being and revelation of the will and history, which is necessarily the end of history. To understand that this is the teleological endpoint of the true history, which is rarely articulated, but in the esoteric sciences and the esoteric metaphysics of human history and reality. And this is our orientation. And when we discuss baseball, we're really discussing one of the richest, if not the richest, historical aesthetic grounds for the production and reproduction of this experience, which is super historical. This experience, which is superhuman. And again, this returns us to the essence of cosmic heroism and this idea of cosmic heroism, which is articulated by Ernest Becker in his Denial of Death. This reality which is possible within this sort of time-bound, entropic, entropy-bound, organismic relationship and interfacing with space-time, which again is in this thermodynamic process, which is the energetic process of the cosmos, which is inherently and essentially tied to the scales of the will, which are themselves the thermonuclear fusion process of stars, all the way down to the synapses of the brain and single-celled organisms. We're looking at a scalar existence and scalar process, which is metaphysically singular. And so to orient oneself entirely toward these powers is to, in fact, create the possibility of the superhuman transcendental life, which is itself spiritual self-realization, profound psychological and psychic recognition of the total powers of the being, which is the understanding of the true identity as is articulated in Christ, and specifically the Christ transmission as a transmission of the metaphysics and the metabolic powers of being. And so what we're dealing with is there's this sort of a lag, or as I've described it in my previous documents, which are more entirely metaphysically oriented, this escape velocity, which itself is implicit and explicit in the attempt of a fast-moving or fast evolutionary object attempting to break the gravity, which is attempting to break the space of the planetary system or the species system, which is the current status of consciousness, which is to say a status of consciousness which is enraptured into this consumptive mechanism, which again is consumption, reproduction, survival, which characterizes the human species and characterizes nearly all of its outcomes and outputs into history and time, which is then the catalog of humanity and the archive of the culture of humanity, which is essentially a repetition. And to break this is a revelation and recognition of this consciousness, again, the fundamental ontological status of consciousness, the ontos of consciousness, which is an inherently recombinative, elemental, experiential playfulness, which is occurring at all scales. Again, as we discussed in the physical and genetic precepts, to understand that identity, that status of character, but then to combine it necessarily and crucially with this critical cultural dimension, which is the creation of the possibility of the revelation of these powers, this participation in the ritual or the rite, which is the necessary grounds or the theater to emerge this suprahuman possibility, which is the possibility of the will into space and time as a practice, as a way of being in space of time, again, as a way of being in the world, which is itself a radical and critical rupture from the historical past of humanity and its previous and primary rituals, which for the most part, accepting the mystery traditions of history and the shamanic and medicine traditions, which are piercings of the veil into the supra and a prior phenomenological reality of space-time into the essential will and apprehension of that essential will, whether that's through meditation or ritual or rite as revelation or theater. To regularly practice this tradition in a very grounded, material, physical way of the emergence of this suprahuman, superordinate will through the powers of the human body. And thus, this is so much of what Nietzsche discusses when he discusses the will to power, and power and strength themselves being essential and critical to a healthy existence. It's not just in a physical, organismic, animalistic way that power itself stratifies existence in terms of animal hierarchies and animal behavior, but rather that power itself in a metaphysical, spiritual, and consciousness-based paradigm, which is necessarily supra-material and supra-elemental, into revelation. Again, when we're talking about the will, we're talking about revelation of the powers which were once hid or are implicit in creation, but which are hid behind the veil of the seeming materiality of things. We're talking about the essence which emerges beneath and beyond those things, and the necessary and requisite realm of perception and sensate apprehension to know, to perceive, to comprehend, and to apprehend that will, that essential willingness, and bring that to the light of day, to articulate it. But more so and primary to that articulation is the participation in the unveiling of the powers of it, which is to say to realize those powers within oneself as in true self-realization. And this is so much of the critical vehicle of baseball and baseball culture as it occurs in American history, is that it's this I guess the term I want to use, or that comes to mind, is this supersanct ritual which resides above and beyond American history and American culture as we know it, as a sort of rote phenomenon of the reproduction of the political and social status mechanisms and culture, as in a culture of reproduction and survival and consumption, which so much characterizes American history and American modernity, and everything from slavery to consumerism, as basic metabolic principles of the preservation and deification of the individual and the suppression and oppression of another, actually a movement away from self-realization and a movement into consumerist culture, reflecting and refracting self-separation and fragmentation, through which the product one is made whole, or through which the enslavement of another one is made whole economically or resource-wise. Which again, this is tied directly into the history of capitalism, feudalism, oppression and exploitation of individuals as a historical aperture through which the real question of being and meaning is evaded, is not truly confronted. But in this daily ritualized practice of the revelation of the powers of the will through this critical craft of embodiment, which is so particular of and to baseball, in this high aesthetic dimension in which the human being as another is not necessarily confronted really at all whatsoever, but rather the aesthetic object, as in the ball, the bat, the glove, the field. And one's attention and absorption into this meditative state of contemplation of the aesthetic object and participation in play with the aesthetic object, as is so clearly articulated. And you'll see and hear the symbolic and archetypal resonance in the Heraclitean quote, which I elucidated in the previous essay. The aeon is a child at play with colored balls. This is a primary articulation of the athleticism and the sport of the cosmos, which then, of course, is translated through, again, this predisposition and predispossession and obsession with the baseball, right? The speed of the ball as it moves through space, the variety of grips which produce different mechanical or physical outcomes, the spins which are put on the ball by the wrist and the arm and the motion of the pitcher, the movement of the bat through space and the reaction time of the hitter to apprehend and comprehend the delivery of the pitch, where it appears to be going, and the rapidity of the milliseconds it takes to acquire and ascertain an act in this space. This is a total microcosm, a participatory revelation in the immanence of time and the immanence of experience and the embodiment, the ascertainment and the direction and orientation of the will toward the metaphysical achievement of the aesthetic object. This is a use and a presencing and the harnessing of the entire powers of the human being, the entire aperture and architecture of the human being toward the aesthetic object of achievement in this synthesized and synthetic ecosystem in which the powers of the will are given stage and standing, status and process and possibility to emerge. It really is this simple. But again, what is so critical is to directly and correctly ascertain the character and status of being as an essence, right? As the will itself, which is transcendental and prior to any sort of figuration or form or organism, which inherently at its root and foundation and at its base is that will, which is to say the manifestation of the essential recombinative creative will of play, which again is very clearly scientifically verifiable across disciplines, from genetics to stellar nucleosynthesis, the creation of different galactic systems which exchange energy within them, down to the genome of the human species and the genomes of life on Earth and how they evolve and transform through the processing of information. To understand that status of character, essentially, right, and then to incorporate that and to create situations and circumstances for that essential character and status of will to innately emerge, and thus for that human identity to become ever more so identified with the truth of reality and existence primary and primarily, which is a return of the organism which has been in a delimited biochemical aperture, a way of seeing and perceiving reality which is devoted to the predictable outcomes of the march of the species or the march of the genome, which is just a reproduction of the same rote circumstances of life on an endless repetition to create, as in the Hindu karma or the Buddhist wheel of life, to create and recreate the same dispossessed realities which are experienced as suffering, which are experienced as a death of the self and a death of the soul due to wrong identification, due to partial recognition. But then to create this as the real cultural manifesto, as the real abiding system of truth and reality and experience and the ritual and the rite of the everyday, to make this everyday sanctified, which is the repetitive process of the creation and reproduction of that ritual, which again is entirely an aesthetic object, to emerge the transcendental object at the end of time, which is the essential full primordial powers of the will through the jailbroken organism, being and body of the human being, which is the revelation of the powers of that which is, and then to fully understand that which is as the true identity. And this is the creation through culture, right? Which seems to be the most cast off or relegated to entertainment or purely divorced aesthetic contemplation. The full dedication of culture as the first and foremost primary artifact of any and all civilizations, which makes possible the truly civilized or realized self within space, within time, within history, which is the repetitious cultural artifact which makes available the possibility of the realization of the powers of being through the metabolic, entropic human individual and organism, that right as the aesthetic field, as the aesthetic dimension through which the dedication to the aesthetic object emerges the powers of the will first, foremost, and primary beyond the biochemically acculturated programming which ritually defines human history and the possibilities of the human organism. And this is what self-realization is. So that's what I got for this one. I'll catch you on the next.